Hey, welcome to Psychology, our magnet psychology class. Here you are, we're going to look at the social science versus false science, why we study psychology, what psychologists do, the history of psychology, and contemporary perspectives. And then maybe we'll have a lab if we think there's time to do that. All right, psychology is a social science based on verifiable evidence and theories that are tested according to the scientific method. False sciences, on the other hand, do not rely on verifiable evidence. False science is things like astrology is considered a false science. It's based on the idea that the moon and the stars and the planets can affect human personality and density. However, it is not grounded in facts. Social science is based on findings that are subjected to careful scrutiny and are grounded in facts. The Barnum effect. You've probably heard of P.T. Barnum. The tendency to believe in general personality reports such as horoscopes is named after P.T. Barnum, who once said a good circus should have something for everyone. Horoscopes work the same way. They say a lot of things that we want to hear, and that could happen to anybody. What is the basic way in which psychology differs from false sciences, and what do you think those false sciences are so widespread? The false science of astrology uses 12 signs of the zodiac to try to explain the past and predict the future. Psychologists carry out true scientific research and processes. Here, a psychologist uses a video of a healthy arm to help alleviate the phantom pain of a patient's amputated arm. And so this is an interesting thing that we study in psychology that's related to what's called mirror neurons. Psychology is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. This is the definition of psychology. Psychologists seek to observe, describe, and explain and predict and modify behavior and mental processes. Psychologists rely on research to learn whether certain methods will work before they use them to help people. So the main idea of this section will be psychology is a science. Like other sciences, psychologists seek to explain and control behavior and mental processes, and they test their ideas through research methods, and as we talked about at the beginning of the course. So as you're reading through the chapter, you should be concerned about how our behavior and mental processes are different. What are the some basic goals of psychology, and how is psychology a science? So this would be a good question to discuss. I do want to solve all my problems, but I'll wait till it comes out in softcover. So you have all these books. All right. Psychology is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. Behavior is any action that people can observe or measure, such as walking, talking, sleeping, or eating. Cognitive activities are mental processes. They include dreams, perceptions, thoughts, and memories. Emotions can affect both behavior and mental processes. To study emotions, psychologists might use psychological constructs to help them study what we cannot see, touch, or measure directly. So what do psychologists study? Behavior and mental processes. Psychologists observe and describe behavior and mental processes to better understand them. The examples of sports psychologists can help athletes improve their performance by measuring athletes' heart rates and other body processes, and by interviewing athletes. Psychologists explain behavior that might hinder an athlete's performance. Predicting and controlling. Psychologists predict that athletes perform best when anxiety is moderate. Psychologists help athletes control their behavior and mental processes by teaching them how to control their anxiety. Positive visualization is one method sports psychologists use to help athletes perform better. Psychologists focus on helping people reach their own goals. Okay? So, how do psychologists help change behavior? By understanding the factors that influence human behavior, teaching people how to filter out those distractions and keep their anxiety at tolerable levels. Psychology is a social science rooted in natural sciences. Social sciences include history, anthropology, economics, political science, and sociology. Natural sciences include biology, chemistry, and physics. Here in America, this is how we categorize psychology as a social science. However, in Europe, it's often classified as a hard science. Some areas of psychology are closely related to the natural sciences. Both natural scientists and psychologists do scientific research to do their work. Psychological research, two widely used research methods are surveys and experimentation. Surveys collect data through questions asked of a particular group. Experimentation usually involves people or animals. Some psychologists believe animal research can be applied to humans. Psychologists organize research finding into theories. A theory is a statement that attempts to explain why things are the way they are and why they happen as they do. Theories help psychologists form principles. A principle is a basic truth or law. So, in what ways is psychology similar to other sciences? Like other sciences, psychology seeks to answer questions by following the steps involved in scientific research. Neuroimaging and cognitive research. Neuroimaging allows scientists to study the human brain as it functions. Positron emissions topography, or PET, and magnetic resonance imaging, or the MRI, are two technologies that create images of the brain as it processes mental functions. Neuroimaging has been useful in cognitive research. Cognitive research is the study of mental processes and mental disorders. Neuroimaging may help psychologists diagnose and cure mental disorders. Neuroimaging has been used to study Alzheimer's parents, and some psychologists are skeptical about the value of neuroimaging. They claim that neuroimaging shows how the brain behaves, but tells little about how the mind or conscious thought works. And here's a picture of a patient going into a 3D MRI brain scan. These are 3 panels of MRI brain scans show evidence of abnormalities. And you can see here that they have large lesions in the brain. This is probably a person with Alzheimer's or some kind of severe brain damage. And here again, you can see the brain is receding away from the skull. So, why might neuroimaging be an important aid in the treatment of mental disorders? And do you think neuroimaging has much practical application in psychology? Why or why not? Pause and give this a moment to think about. Section 2. What psychologists do. The major fields in psychology include clinical, developmental, and experimental psychology. Psychologists also work in applied or specialized fields such as community, forensics, health psychology. Our main idea for this section is psychologists work in many different fields, but they all focus on studying and explaining behavior and mental processes. What are some of the major fields in psychology? How do specialists in some applied fields of psychology serve people's needs? these are the questions you should be able to answer by the time we finish this section. Major fields in psychology. Clinical psychology. Most psychologists are clinical psychologists. Clinical psychology includes child mental health, adult mental health, learning disabilities, geriatrics, and general health. Clinical psychologists treat people with psychological problems such as anxiety, depression, or severe psychological disorders. Psychologists are not psychiatrists. A psychiatrist is a medical doctor who specializes in psychological programs who can prescribe medication for clients. Psychologists may not prescribe medication. Counseling psychologists typically treat people who have adjustment problems. They often work in businesses or higher educational institutions. School psychologists identify and help students who have problems that interfere with learning. School psychologists use interviews, tests, and observation to help students. Educational psychology, and you've all had contact with one of these. Educational psychologists focus on course planning, instructional methods on the entire school system rather than for an individual student. They focus on how learning is affected by psychological factors, cultural factors, economic factors, and instructional methods. Some educational psychologists help prepare standardized tests, and they also study various tests to determine college success. Developmental psychologists study changes that occur throughout a person's lifespan. These changes can be physical, emotional, cognitive, or social. A famous study of the developmental psychology is the 7-Up series, and we'll talk about that later. Some developmental psychologists are especially interested in the challenges of adolescence. Personality psychology. Personality psychologists identify and study human characteristics or traits. They are interested in the origins of psychological problems and disorders. Also, they're concerned with issues such as anxiety, aggression, and gender roles. Social psychologists are concerned with people's social behavior. They focus on external rather than internal influences. Experimental psychology. Psychologists in all specialties may conduct experimental research, but experimental psychologists conduct research into basic processes such as functions of the nervous system, sensation, perception, learning, memory, and thinking and motivation. Experimental psychologists study the biological and psychological reasons for cognitive behavior. Biological psychologists study relationships between biological changes and psychological events. Experimental psychologists are more likely than other psychologists to do research. Basic research is research that has no immediate application and is done for its own sake. So which types of psychologists might treat patients with eating disorders? Clinical and developmental psychologists. The clinical psychologists and the developmental psychologists. Developmentally, because most eating disorders happen at adolescence and early adulthood, and the clinical psychologists would work with them because of the abnormal behavior that is related to an eating disorder. So here's a chart on the different graduate programs that are available or that people participate in. As you can see, 48% of the people who go into psychology end up in the clinical field. Different careers in psychology. Specialized fields are environmental psychology, how people influence and are influenced by their physical environment. Comparative psychology, the study of animal behavior across different species. Consumer psychology, the study of behavior of shoppers. So environmental psychologists are folks that are discovering things like about the need for us to be able to routinely get sunlight and that kind of thing during the winter. Industrial psychology is the study of people and work, and what an industrial psychologist will do is he'll study, if you work in a factory, he'll study how you're working and how it's going, and then he'll try to find ways for you to be more productive in your work on the assembly line. Organizational psychology study how people behave in organizations such as businesses, firms. Psychologists in this field are often trained in both areas, employed by corporations to improve working conditions and increase output. Human factor psychology. Human factor psychologist tries to find the best ways to design products for people to use. They consider how the product will be used and how the product affects people and how the product looks, feels, and how the product will be engineered so it is safe, durable, and comfortable to use. So these human factor psychologists are the guys that try to figure out where's the right place to put the knob on the stove or on your car, or what, so that it's easy and accessible. These human factors is used a great deal in programming because they measure where your eye is drawn to and that sort of thing. Community psychologists study and help create social systems that promote and foster individual well-being. Social systems might include mental health centers, hospital programs, and school-based programs. They focus on promoting change in the social environment, helping relatively powerless people, and preventing threats to the mental health in the social environment. Forensic psychologists, which there's a large number of people that are drawn to this area. Forensic psychologists work in the criminal justice system. They determine psychological competence of a defendant. Contrary to what most people think, it is not easy to get an insanity defense. They explain how psychological problems lead to criminal behavior, and they work with people, departments to help select police officers, help officers cope with job stress, train officers in handling a dangerous situation such as hostage crises, family violence, and suicide threats. Health psychology is the study of behavior and mental processes relate to physical health. Health psychologists study how stress affects health problems, and they also focus on disease prevention. Rehabilitation psychology is rehabilitation psychologists work with people challenged by a disability, and they help the patients develop strategies to compensate for that disability and live a meaningful life. So they might help a person become rehabilitated after a severe injury or something like that. Cross-cultural psychology is an interesting field. Cross-cultural psychologists study behavior and mental processes under different cultural conditions. They've brought new insights to standard psychological theories. Example, they've discovered that visual perception develops differently in cultures as a result of the shapes and angles people are exposed to every day. A lot of the studies that are done mostly on the European-type populations because most of the psychologists in psychological field have been developed in North America and in Europe. And so when many of the concepts are applied to other cultures, they aren't as accurate because those other cultures have, different coping mechanisms. So what do forensic psychologists do? They testify about the psychological competence of defendants. They explain how certain kinds of psychological problems give rise to criminal behavior. They assist in selecting officers. They help police officers cope with job stress and handle dangerous situations. Inside the criminal mind. a horrific crime is committed, a psychological profiler examines the evidence. After he inspects the body, evaluates the footprint on the dusty floor, and scrutinizes the cryptic message scrawled on the wall, the profiler declares that the suspect is a young white male who lives with his parents and is uncomfortable around women. Is he right? Probably not. Profilers often give broad description that could fit most people. Lie detector tests are meant to help see inside a criminal mind, but they are often unreliable. There are no definitive or definite methods for detecting when a person lies. So, why do people believe that a reliable lie detector test can be developed? Do you think a reasonable profile of a suspect can ever be deduced from a crime scene evidence? Why or why not? Section 3, A History of Psychology. Psychology is as old as human history, with its roots going back as far as ancient Egypt and Greece. The scientific approach, which began in the 1500s, led to the birth of modern psychology in the 1800s. Modern psychologists continually propose new theories focused on behavioral and cognitive research. Since ancient times, philosophers and scientists have studied behavior and mental processes. Psychologists throughout history have continued to refine and develop these studies. So, what you should focus on during this section is what were some of the early views and beliefs about human behavior? Who were some of the pioneers of psychology? And what modern developments in psychology have dominated much of the 20th century? Psychology is as old as human history. Written account of interest in people's actions, motives, and thoughts can be traced to ancient times. In ancient Greece, Socrates developed a method of learning called introspection, which means to carefully examine our own thoughts and feelings. Aristotle outlined associationism, the theory that association with past experience is the basic principle of mental activity. Most Europeans of this period believed that the psychological problems were caused by possession by demons. They used certain tests to determine whether a person was possessed. And if they found you were possessed, they sunk you in the river or burned you at the stake or something like that. So what are the basic foundation of psychology did the ancient Greeks set forth? Examining thoughts and feelings, studying human behavior, linking thoughts, feelings, and behaviors to biological factors. Early psychologists in ancient cultures, a shaman was believed to cure what would be considered psychological disorders today by consulting the spirit world. Here, people honor contemporary shaman in a traditional ceremony in Mongolia. Why might people have looked to shamans in the spirit world for answers to their disorders? Pioneers in psychology. Most historians of psychology point to the year 1879 as the beginning of psychology as a modern laboratory science. In that year, German psychologist Wilhelm Wundt established his laboratory in the city of Leipzig. So you should write that down. Wilhelm Wundt and structuralism. Wundt founded a field of psychology known as structuralism. Structuralism focused on basic elements of consciousness. Wundt broke down consciousness into objective sensations, subjective feelings, and structuralists believed that human mind functioned by combining objective sensations and subjective feelings. William James became our first prominent psychologist in America. Experience is a continuous stream of consciousness. James is one of the founders of functionalism. Functionalism is the study of how mental processes help organisms adapt to their environment. Sigmund Freud, who's probably the most well-known psychologist of all time, Freud was the most famous of early psychologists. He developed psychoanalysis, which is still used today. It emphasizes unconscious motives and internal conflicts in human behavior. He developed psychodynamic thinking, which assumes that most of what exists in the individual's mind is unconscious and consists of conflicting impulses, urges, and wishes. He theorized the key to human behavior is satisfying our desires. So, structuralism, founded by William Wundt back in 1879 with his first psychological laboratory experiments. Because Wundt established psychology as a field of study separate from philosophy and natural sciences, Wundt is considered one of the founders of modern psychology. The lab Wundt set up in 1879 is still in operation today. He viewed mental processes as activities and classified feelings as pleasant, unpleasant, tense, relaxed, excited, or depressed. William James, in addition to being the father of American psychology, James is considered one of America's great philosophers. Trained in medicine, James commented that the first lecture on psychology he ever heard was the first one he presented, a new instructor at Harvard. He believed that science, the truth of an idea, can never be proved. We should focus instead on how practical or productive an idea, its cash value, as he called it. Sigmund Freud, declaration that people essentially have little free will and are subjected to the feelings of the unconscious mind, was highly revolutionary. He psychoanalyzed himself and extensively studied his own dreams, memories, personality, and concluded that he had many mental disorders and fears. Many psychologists were initially scandalized by Freud's emphasis on sexual origins of psychological disorders. John B. Watson was the most famous experiment involved, of behaviorism. John B. Watson was the most famous experiment involved conditioning a small child to fear a white rat by associating the rat with a loud, frightening sound. He believed that people have three basic emotional reactions: fear, rage, and love. B.F. Skinner eventually took the work of Watson and made it into a true science. In contrast with Watson, Skinner believed that the behavior depended what happened after a stimulus, an event, or a sensation, not before. He called this operant behavior. So, according to Freud, what's the key to people's behavior? Unconscious motives and internal conflicts. Modern developments in psychology. John B. Watson and behaviorism. John B. Watson founded the school of behaviorism, which defines psychology as a scientific study of observable behavior. It holds that people can be totally conditioned by external events, that belief in individual choice is just an illusion. This work was largely founded on, was an extension of the work of classical conditioning discovered by Pavlov. B.F. Skinner, on the other hand, believed in reinforcement. He added to behaviorist tradition by adding reinforcement. He showed that animals that are reinforced or rewarded for a certain action are more likely to perform that action again. He believed people learn in the same way animals do, It's just a more sophisticated form, but it's still the same result. Many of today's educational games are based on the work of B.F. Skinner. Gestalt psychology is an alternative to behaviorism and structuralism. It was developed by the German psychologists Max Wertheimer, Kurt Kafka, and Wolfgang Kohler. It is based on the idea that our perceptions of objects are more than the sum of their parts. There are wholes that give shape or meaning to the parts. Gestalt psychology rejects the structuralist idea that experience can be broken down into individual parts or elements. It also rejects the behaviorist idea that only observable behavior is important. These drawings demonstrate the idea that perception of something is affected by the context in which it occurs. Two images that are identical may appear to be different than their surroundings are different. So when you look at this, the two blue circles, which one's larger? Or are they the same size? Because of the small circles on the outside, this one appears larger and this one appears smaller, but in actuality they're the same size. When you read this line, A, B, C, D, you see it as a B rather than a 13. However, when you see it in this line, you see it as a 13. This is the Gestalt concept that you have to see. We see things as their whole instead of the sum of their parts, and their sum of their parts are what is really what we're observing. So how do you think B.F. Skinner would view introspection? He would probably dismiss it as unscientific. In fact, introspection has been dropped from the psychological realm because of the fact that it largely depends on people's own personal opinion of what is happening at the time. It is very subjective. Section 4, contemporary perspectives of psychology. Some contemporary psychologists focus on the role of biology or the role of mind in seeking to the understanding behavior and mental processes. Other psychologists study how our personal experiences affect how we perceive the world. Still, other psychologists take a more holistic approach and study the interaction of biology, psychology, and social factors as their combined impact on people. Contemporary psychologists have been influenced the work of earlier pioneers. They have been expanded traditional research to develop new and different approaches. So what role of biology in behavior and survival, and what role does the mind play in determining behavior? How does the role of experience affect behavior, and what factors influence biopsychosocial perspective? EQ is your emotional quotient, and women tend to be much better at it than men. Because they're able to interpret others' emotions. The biological perspective of psychology emphasizes the influence of biology on our behavior. Biologically oriented psychologists focus on connections between the brain and behavior. They also focus on the influences of hormones and genes. The evolutionary perspective focuses on the evolution of behavior and mental processes. Evolutionary psychologists suggest that many kinds of behavior patterns are examples of adaptive behavior. What role does biology play in our mental health processes? The nervous system makes mental processes possible. The role of the mind. The cognitive perspective emphasizes the role that thoughts play in determining behavior. The cognitive tradition has roots in Socrates' maxim, know thyself. Many cognitive psychologists have been influenced by information processing in computer science. The humanistic perspective stresses the human capacity for self-fulfillment and the importance of consciousness, self-awareness, and the capacity to make choices. According to this perspective, personal experiences are the most important aspect of psychology. The psychoanalytic perspective stresses the influence of unconsciousness forces on human behavior. Psychologists who follow the approach focus on conscious choice. Psychoanalytic thought no longer dominates the field, but is the influence continues to be felt. Birth order. There are studies in birth order. According to some fellow psychoanalytic perspective, some who follow the psychoanalytic perspective, the order in which one is born into a family can have a major impact on that personality. The firstborn child tend to be high achievers. They're responsible but conservative. The middle-born children tend to be even-tempered, loyal, and hardworking. And the last-born child tend to be likable, spontaneous, and persistent. Only children tend to be confident, intelligent, and organized. So they're kind of like firstborn children. So how do humanistic and psychoanalytic psychologists differ in their views that drives behavior? The humanistic psychologists believe that self-awareness and experience and choice allow people to choose their own behavior, whereas psychoanalytic psychologists hold that unconscious forces shape our behavior. The learning perspective emphasizes the effects of experience on behavior. In contrast, social learning theory suggests that people can change their environments or create new roles. Psychologists who take learning perspective believe that behavior is learned either from direct experience or by observing other people. The sociocultural perspective focuses on the influence of ethnicity, gender, culture, socioeconomic status on behavior and mental processes. So, how can ethnicity and gender affect cultural expectations and social roles? By emphasizing individual differences. The biopsychosocial perspective holds that mental processes are influenced by interaction of biological processes, psychological dispositions, and social factors. This is a holistic approach that dates back to ancient Greece. The modern model was developed by American physician George Engel. It was developed in relation to the treatment of heart disease. Cultural, social, and psychological factors and genetic disposition as well as diet, exercise, stress levels, and financial status all have bearing on heart disease, according to Engel. So what generalizations can you make about the relation of biopsychosocial approach to the psychological perspective? Includes several other psychological perspectives. Cultural diversity in psychology was dominated in the past by white men. Psychology has been dominated in the past by white men. As I've mentioned before, it's mostly, it was heavily influenced because it kind of rose to popularity in Europe and North America first. Most of the world's psychologists are in North America and Europe, and so they're basing their research on people who are mostly of European descent and trying to apply it to people who aren't necessarily of European descent. Many psychologists today are women and members of ethnic groups. Psychological research is more diverse than ever. The work of African American Psychologist Kenneth Bancroft Clark exemplifies such research. He studied the effects of segregation on black children. What do you think might have been the effects of segregation on white children? Why is it important to psychologists of different genders and cultural backgrounds to carry out research in behavior and mental processes? Incidentally, Kenneth Bancroft Clark's research was used in the Supreme Court case that helped to decide Brown versus Board of Education. Kenneth Clark has an African-American child choose a nice doll in his landmark study effects of segregation. So what they did was they would take the dark doll and the white doll, and they would try to have the child choose which was the good one. And even in minority populations, they tend to choose the white doll. All right. So in this lab, public perceptions of psychology. What perceptions and misrepresentations? What perceptions and misperceptions do people have about the field of psychology? In this lab, you'll conduct a survey to find out how psychology is perceived by the general public. You'll compare your survey and answer those with your classmates. Develop answers for the survey question. Prepare the questionnaire. Maintain courteous and professional manners when administering the survey. Once you have your results of your survey, then study the survey responses, note any patterns, summarize the survey results. Then write a paragraph about what the results reveal about people's perceptions of psychology. Get together with a small group of classmates, compare your survey answers, and discuss questions. Then write a paragraph that summarizes your own views on the discussion questions. Successful survey takers engage their participants by asking follow-up questions that begin with why and how. That concludes our discussion on what is psychology and its origins, and I hope you found this helpful.